who is the Deputy Chief Commissioner and Commissioner of Compliance with the Australian Skills Quality Authority, to take us through some new regulation requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's all about a new approach to regulation. I thought I'd just background, for those of you that don't know, it's now been 3 years since ASQA, the Australian Skills Quality Authority, was established as the national regulator for vocational education and training. ASQA, of course, regulates courses and training providers to ensure that nationally approved quality standards are met. So we have functions in registering training providers as RTOs, registering organisations as Rtos providers, and within that Rtos group, registering English language intensive course providers, known as ELICOS providers, accrediting vet courses, ensuring that providers comply with the requirements of registration, including by conducting compliance audits. Where are the RTOs in Australia? Well, ASQA regulates 3,937 RTOs nationally, and that number, since we opened, has trended downwards slightly. And we have 488 Rtos providers, 221 of which are ELICOS providers, and you can see the breakdown there. So New South Wales has 978 providers, Queensland 1,303, and you can see the percentages there on the slide, and Tasmania 81 registered training organisations. Well, what have we been up to date? We've had almost 20,000 provider applications to process, over 800 vet course accreditation applications, over 4,200 compliance activities, and that includes initial audits, post-initial audits, change application audits, renewal audits, compliance monitoring audits, and the review of evidence that's conducted separately to those audits. So since ASQA was established in July 2011, we've had audits of 1,507 individual RTOs. We've managed over 3,000 complaints. It seems that students, industry, employers and other RTOs know we're there and have discovered how to make a complaint. And we certainly use the intelligence from those complaints, because if there is a trend in a particular complaint area, then that's a flag to us that perhaps we need to go and have a look and see what's happening. And our info line has received over 107,000 calls and over 37,000 emails. Just reflecting on where we're located across Australia, we have a compliance operations office in all of our capital cities. That's the purple dot you can see there. We also have risk analysis, industry engagement, risk assessment, course accreditation in our Queensland office. We have risk assessment, legal and investigations and complaints in our Sydney office. Our corporate staff and our info line are based in Melbourne. We have a risk assessment team in Adelaide. And we also use a panel of contracted auditors to complement our staff auditors. So it's all about a new approach to regulation. ASQA is seeking voluntary compliance by providers with the standards, and we are a risk-based regulator. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to the regulation of registered training organisations and other providers. ASQA's model of cooperative compliance, well, let's just follow through that model. So at the lower end, the lowest risk providers, and I'm pleased to say that's the bulk of providers in Australia. The bulk of providers are doing the right thing. They're willing and able to run a good training business, they're delivering quality outcomes, and they always meet their obligations. So by and large, most providers are in that category. On this particular slide, these are all out of sequence, so I'll just put them all up and talk to them. Okay, so on the far left-hand side, I've just described the providers at the lower end, the lowest risk providers. Moving up then, there are providers who are prepared to run a good training business, and they do strive to deliver quality education outcomes, but sometimes they fail to meet their obligations in some areas. Our approach on the right-hand side is to provide appropriate information and education for those providers, or to remove some privileges of registration if compliance is trending in the wrong direction. So sanctions at the lower end, like amending scope or issuing a written direction. Going back to the left-hand side, the providers who adopt a compliance posture where they're not fully understanding or accepting their obligations, and they often fail to meet them, we deter this behaviour by detection and taking appropriate action. We can issue infringement notices, enforceable undertakings, and we apply the administrative sanctions of cancellation, suspension and amendment. And at the high risk end, and you can see that the triangle is at the pointy end there, and I emphasise that this is a very small number of providers in our vet system in Australia. The providers who deliberately game the system to maximise profit at the expense of training, quality training outcomes. And for those providers, we do try to detect and bring them to account. Going back to the lowest risk providers, of which the majority are in Australia, we make it easy for them to comply, we minimise the compliance costs, we do approvals without an audit and grant delegations, and more about that in a moment. We're only auditing about 5% of change applications. In terms of renewals, where the provider has demonstrated compliance over a period of time, they're considered to be a low-risk provider. We're only auditing in the vicinity of 70% of renewal applications as we embed further our risk-based approach to regulation. So we're refining our national approach to regulation in order to reduce the red tape and the compliance costs for high-performing RTOs with a good track record. But at the same time, we're keeping the pedal on the accelerator, if you like, in terms of our rigorous regulatory approach for those poor quality providers who are high risk and who bring the system into disrepute. ASQA has proposed some regulatory reforms that will see us examining the expansion of delegations to more providers. ASQA currently delegates functions to amend scope of registration and accredit courses to some RTOs, and we're looking to expand those delegations. The improvement of information to RTOs that are not fully meeting national vet standards. We're going to develop some more guidance material to assist providers in their understanding of the national vet standards. We're going to implement a range of other targeted regulatory responses, issuing more written directions, forwarding correspondence, alerting RTOs to the fact that their website may be in breach of the standards, that sort of thing. And we're going to try to reduce the regulatory burden and the cost in areas that add little value to improving the quality of vet and compliance by RTOs. Now, ASQA uses auditing to assess RTOs against the standards for RTOs. And our approach to audit is systematic, rigorous, evidence-based, fair, open and transparent. And we check how we're doing in regard to those claims that we have an approach to audit that are those four things. We have done now 8 surveys. We do quarterly surveys of the RTOs who have had an audit in the previous quarter. And the results have been very steady over time. In the 8th round we recently completed, 92% of those audited reported that they were very satisfied or satisfied with the fairness and transparency of ASQA's audits. There's always room for improvement, and we do listen to the feedback that we receive in those surveys about the things that perhaps didn't go so well. Our audit focus is we're focusing on the organisation providing evidence that it complies and the audit team assessing that evidence to confirm compliance. In working with our auditors, we say that it's really up to the RTO to demonstrate how they are complying, and you are not to specify or prescribe how that evidence should appear. And of course there's an expectation that providers are compliant with the standards at all times. Just going back to those surveys, in terms of our auditors, 95% of the RTOs audited agreed or strongly agreed that they found the audit team to be objective, well organised, knowledgeable and professional, and that was good feedback for us. So our audits are conducted either in response to an application or in response to identified risks. And what we're doing is shifting our focus in ASQA more to this response to identified risks, not being an application-driven regulator. We conduct strategic industry reviews in response to identified risks across an industry or a training product, and I'd like to share with you some of the results of those strategic audits that we did last year. Audits of RTOs are conducted against the standards for registered training organisations. Now, we have a view in ASQA that perhaps those standards could be improved, and that's why we contributed, we had a commitment to contributing to the NSSC review of those standards. Now, those standards that the NSSC endorsed, the revised standards, have been provided to Minister McFarlane, and he's currently looking at those standards with a view to implementing them at some stage. We do audits of Crycos providers that's conducted under the National Code of Practice for Registration Authorities and Providers of Education and Training to Overseas Students, that's the National Code, and also ELICOS providers against that code and the National ELICOS standards. And when we're scoping an audit, we look at a range of factors relating to a particular provider to determine how we will focus our audit. The one standard that RTOs appear to have the greatest issues with is Standard 15. And that's true here in Tasmania as well. And this is the picture. This bar graph shows the audits of existing Tasmanian RTOs for the period 1st of October 13 through to the 31st of March. And you can see that the compliance with Standard 15.2, which is about meeting the requirements of the training package, and Standard 15.4, qualified and competent trainers and assessors, are standards of concern. The assessment done properly one nationally, that's Standard 15.5, that requires a provider to ensure that the assessment is meeting the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. That particular standard is causing RTOs some issues as well. it's our hope that the revised standards will be clearer and make it a whole lot easier for RTOs to comply with those standards. ASQA's findings about assessment generally have been echoed in some recent research undertaken by the NCVER, and Halliday, Wines and Misco found that trainers and assessors lack the skills and expertise to conduct valid assessments. They found that RTOs aren't providing repeated practice, the practice that's needed to demonstrate competence. There's a lack of work placements, inadequate rigour in assessment processes, an unclear role for industry and employers, and a lack of systematic validation and moderation. ASQA's functions include the conduct of strategic reviews. ASQA is empowered by its legislation to review or examine any aspect of an RTO's operations to determine any systemic issues that relate to quality. And in 2013, we undertook our inaugural strategic review program where we looked at training for aged and community care, training for the construction industry white card, and and the marketing and advertising practices of RTOs. The reports of these reviews were released in December 2013, and there were 24 recommendations. And I can say that it is all about shifting our work as a national regulator to just this kind of review, focusing on systemic issues and not being application driven. So what have we found to date? Well, the findings in terms of the aged and community care review, the quality of training varies widely. We found that training programs are largely too short, with insufficient time in a workplace for sufficient skills development. We found that most RTOs have difficulty complying with the assessment requirements. 87.7% of RTOs were found to be not compliant with at least one of the standards when we went in and did the audit, but given time to respond to the non-compliances, only 20.8% of RTOs remained non-compliant at that time. Our recommendations, there were 10, and they focused on continuing making the regulatory scrutiny of aged and community care training a very high priority. So it's on our list when our auditors are scoping an audit. If the provider is delivering aged and community care, then that qualification or qualifications will be included as part of that audit. Information workshops on training and assessment will be conducted over the next 6 months in conjunction with the Industry Skills Council. We've made recommendations about revisions that are needed to the national standards and to the training packages themselves, and we have recommended to the Industry Skills Councils that there be benchmarks for minimum volume of learning for these qualifications to avoid this problem of too short a course. I ran into the chair of the ASIQA, the Childcare Quality Authority, in an airport lounge, and of course the first thing she said to me was, "Di, what are we doing about these short courses in childcare training?" It's obviously a big issue in the sector, and certainly one we found when we were doing our strategic audit, and so we think there is a definite need for more specification, more assistance for RTOs in how to determine the period for that learning, or the minimum volume for that learning. The white card review, now this is the white card that's issued to people going on to construction sites and is about working safely in the construction industry. We found a great variety in the state requirements for work health and safety regulation in this area. Most registered training organisations have difficulty complying with the assessment requirements. Training programs delivered online were too short and without any time in a workplace for sufficient skills development, even though the unit of competency does specify that some of the assessment must occur in the workplace. And there were big concerns we had about the student identification, verification, or the authentication of the person being assessed, if you like, in this review. So there were real issues in terms of the authentication of the people enrolling online, being assessed online, and getting this white card, which is effectively a licence to go onto a construction site. So to achieve change, the key areas that we thought needed a focus were a redevelopment of the unit of competency, the inclusion of a minimum duration of training, revision again to the national standards for RTOs to assist providers comply in this regard, information workshops on training and assessment, which will be happening in the next 6 months, and a continued focus on the unit in our regulatory activities. The Marketing and Advertising Practices Review used a little bit of a different methodology in that we had a look at the websites and advertising information supplied by a large sample of RTOs. And 45% of RTOs that we had a look at were marketing and advertising in a misleading way. Some practices breached the standards required in order to offer national qualifications. Again, the standard is fairly loose here. It talks about advertising and marketing that has integrity, and we hope that in the revised standards that there'll be some clearer criteria about exactly what ethical marketing is with respect to training. And we also found that consumers, including students and employers, are often provided with ambiguous or insufficient information to make informed training choices. Sorry, and just going back one, organisations that are not RTOs are acting as brokers for those who are, in which in many cases is misleading consumers. So we have this entry of brokers into the vocational education and training market who are offering to line students up with providers, probably for a fee, and those brokers don't make it easy for students or employers to see, well, who is actually delivering the training here? Who is the RTO that will guarantee the quality of my training? So our recommendations in this area were to make the marketing and advertising a very high priority in our activity, to seek a revision to the national standards relating to marketing and advertising, national workshops to reinforce and explain the requirements of the standards to RTOs. We had a recommendation for the then NSSC, the Skills Council, and other vet regulators to work together to address the volume of learning concerns. This, again, the short course, not really providing enough time for anyone to develop the competency, and a consideration of possible measures to ensure that consumers using vet brokers are fully protected. In 2014, we're undertaking 3 more strategic reviews, this time targeting early childhood, security programs and equine training programs. I think I made a bad blue back there. I was talking about childcare when I should have been talking about aged care training, so I do apologise for that. We've commenced our early childhood audits this year. In fact, I think we've completed the sample of RTOs that we were to audit there. Security training is another focus for us, and we've had our first meeting with our industry management committee that guides us in the conduct of that strategic review. And the third one is equine training programs that are delivered across Australia. We'll be sampling providers who are delivering any training dealing with horses, although there's a lot of training dealing with horses, and we're going to have to isolate or refine our focus in that particular audit. And we hope to have those reviews completed by the end of the year. So these reviews not only have an audit component, but we also go out and survey employers about their views about what's happening in terms of the training in these industries. We try to interview people who've graduated from certificates that have been issued as part of that training, and we have conducted some round tables for people to come along and just have a chat about their experience of training in those areas. So we approach these reviews from a bit of a broader methodology than strictly the compliance audit. It's all about improved information and education providers and ASQA's for providers and ASQA's strategy for engagement with providers. And I'm just moving to the middle of the slide because I am running short of time. We plan to increase our information and guidance for providers, and this will include the redesign and rebranding of our website in July, a comprehensive national program of provider information sessions that are scheduled for the second half of 2014, and changes to the way that inquiries are handled by ASQA's InfoLine service. We're going to rotate an auditor through that InfoLine service so that there is a qualified auditor there to speak to providers who may wish to ask the more technical questions about compliance with the standards. We continue our engagement with training organisation peak bodies, and we identify issues of concern. We discuss ways to improve the efficiency of regulation. We discuss strategic issues that are of mutual concern, and we find better ways to do things. So we have these quarterly roundtables with the provider peak bodies, Community Colleges Australia, TAFE Directors Australia, ACPET, the Australian Council of Private Education and Training. We, through those discussions, they're very fruitful discussions, modify and improve our way of regulating to assist improved compliance. How can you stay up to date with ASQA News and our proposals for reform? You can subscribe to ASQA Update. You can also receive automated updates from training.gov.au. If you subscribe or the notify me of changes link on any training product or RTO page, they'll send you an automated email that advises you of the updates. Future issues, the revised national standards I've talked about. This work undertaken by the former NSSC is under consideration by the Minister, and he has been through the Department's VET Reform Task Force, consulting with providers in the sector about those standards. Government policy on reducing red tape in regulation. ASQA is embracing that and has proposed initiatives in this area. The government's currently undertaking a review more broadly of the vet sector, including regulation, with a view to reform, and ASQA has been working closely with the government and the Department of Industry, especially the task force, on this. And costs and fees are currently under consideration. So in closing, I'd like to just emphasise that for us it's all about risk-based regulation, earned autonomy for the providers who are producing excellent outcomes in the vet sector, and we look forward to working with you all to further these aims. And there's our contact information. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Dianne. I'd like